Okay, I want to talk about a good man is hard to find and where you're going, where you've been, and the comparison, of course, that I want to look at most specifically is between Grandma and Connie, because in both of these, they're both facing death, and so we're going to look at how they do that. But anyway, I always start kind of talking about, who is grandma and how do we know? And that is a really good way to approach any piece of literature. I mean, you've always got characters and think about reading it as meeting someone and think about how would I, if I was talking to one of my friends and I'd met someone, I'd say, oh, they're this kind of person, like this, like that. You could describe them. How would you do that with a character? And how do you know? Well, you know from what they say, from the way they say it. And in the Telltale Heart and A&P, Sammy's much more believable than Poe's narrator, who's we're clearly is insane. So it's not just we believe people because they're telling their story. It's how they tell their story. But then also when we think about stories, we also know about people, how other people react to them, and not just, of course, what they say, but what they do. That difference in Delusions of Modern Primitivism, the film, where we've got Jerome saying he's suffering and he's oppressed, but he's driving out of a good neighborhood. He's driving a classic car that looks pristine. He's dropping $500 to get shot. His oppression doesn't look like it runs very deep. So that difference between what we say and what we do is, of course, there too. Anyway, so I'm going to go through a few things on what is grandma, and then what I really want to get to is the point where she meets the misfit and she meet and look at, how does grandma react to this situation? And, what do we learn through that? And where's she really coming from in terms of, who is she and what this kind of says about her and shows about her? And of course, what does some of those mysterious last words? Good Man is Hard to Find is written in 1953, 54, and that may seem like forever ago, but it's really not that long ago. And it is, right kind of on the verge of, civil rights, which are kind of building and bubbling because, those things don't just happen. It didn't just happen in the 60s. So, there is awareness of civil rights, things like that. We're still in the middle of Jim Crow laws. But anyway, let me move on. So, real quickly at the first of the story, we learn a lot about Grandma, that she lived with her only son. We see her have these moments where she's telling Bailey, I wouldn't take my children in any direction with a criminal. I couldn't answer to my conscience. So we learn she's very manipulative. And even though she complained about wanting to go, she's the first one in the car. And then she brings her cat, which she knows Bailey's told her not to. So she brings Pretty Thing, brings her cat with her. And she does things like write down the mileage. She thought it would be interesting to say. So, this points to, is that cute or is that kind of being know-it-all? Well, let me tell you, we did this and that. So it's a whole lot. And then it goes into, into what she wore. And I mean, this is like a huge, not a huge paragraph, but look at the detail in terms of what she wore. The white cotton gloves, the navy blue straw sailor hat with a bunch of white violets on the brim, a navy blue dress with a small white dot in the front. Her collars and cuffs were white organdy trimmed with lace. In case of an accident, anyone seeing her dead on the highway would know at once that she was a lady. And this, of course, becomes very important for Grandma. It is throughout that. I mean, because a good man is hard to find is about a good man, right? And so this idea of who are good people and who judges who good people are. How do you know someone's good or bad? So that becomes very key. And here we see Grandma wanting to make sure that anybody could just look at her and know she's a lady, which tells us something about what she thinks is goodness. And part of that goodness in her mind is how a person looks. So it's definitely about kind of that vanity and that pride from her perspective. But then we start meeting a new grandma too, and we do see that she is racist. She says things like this. And then in the story right after that, she uses the N-word and yes, it was the 50s, and more people were racist to more of an extent. But still, readers even in the 50s would understand this because it's starting to move away from it. And O'Connor is a Southern writer, and so she's writing in the South, and she understands to the extent that she could as a white woman, racism. Um, and Miss, she tells this story about, this man she dated, but that she didn't end up marrying, or um, that, oh yeah, when she had been a maiden lady. And she says, tells June Star, when June Star's like, I wouldn't have married somebody that just bought me a watermelon, that look, he was a gentleman, and then he died a very wealthy man. So again, here's this another level of kind of what is good, what would be desirable. So we've got the looks, we've got the gentleman, we've got the wealth. And then whenever she meets Red Sammy, we, learn a lot about her there too. Red Sammy says these days you don't know who to trust, and grandmother says, of course, times are not like they used to be. In every generation, you can go back and look at the Greeks complaining about the new generation of kids and how things aren't like they used to be. So we've always done that. But she tells Red Sammy when he's let some people get some gas on credit, and she says, it's because you're a good man. And he says a good man's hard to find. And everything's terrible now. And then he and the grandmother discussed better times. So, another kind of part of this goodness is this understanding of, okay, well, this is how it was when I grew up. This is where I'm comfortable. This is the way people were. And this is the way people should continue to be. And we see that, whether, you're looking at a younger generation and you're saying, oh, they're all lazy and they're going to the dogs, which is what the Greeks said. And what everybody said about every generation. Or, you're younger and you're looking at older people and you're like, dude, it's time to change. Maybe we don't need to do everything the same all the time. So we see this lament there too. And of course, it's very human. But when it's piled on top of kind of all these other things, it does paint a very specific picture of her and kind of what she sees as goodness. So the main point is she's walking around and she's judging all this goodness. And she's saying, I know what goodness is, and she expects other people to kind of see that and agree with her. And that's, of course, why she loves Red Sammy. And then, of course, she tells that lie about the house. They end up going the wrong way. And then after they wreck, she realizes that house wasn't in Georgia, but in Tennessee. So, it was all for naught. So they end up wrecked. And, of course, you knew we were going to meet the misfit. And there they are. And who is the one who says, you're the misfit? Of course, it's the grandmother. And he says, it would have been better for all of you, lady, if you hadn't have recognized me. So from this point on, the focus really is on the grandmother and the misfit and their conversation. And they have this weird conversation that is, it's very philosophical. The misfit actually turns out to be quite the philosopher. Now, about the philosopher, in terms of kind of religious philosophy and everything like that, he's clearly thought things through. But the key part that I want to kind of focus on is, how does grandmother make her argument to him? She's going through, and her family's there. This is her only son. It says, it's her only son, so presumably she has some daughters. Irrelevant right now because they're not there. This is her daughter-in-law, which doesn't seem to have much affection for. But these are also her grandchildren. So there's June Star and John Wesley, and there's the baby. And so grandma ends up, Bailey becomes very ineffectual. He tries and really is kind of shushed, and the misfit clearly understands that grandma is the one that's going to do all the talking there. So this becomes grandma, wheeling and dealing. And what is it that she sees that she can try to convince this man not to kill her in those moments? So that's where we're going to look. So it all begins, of course, she says, you wouldn't shoot a lady. And so that, of course, is her premise. I'm a lady. I'm so good as a lady, you wouldn't shoot me. And, of course, you're a man, so the male-female dynamic of you wouldn't do this to a lady, which is really interesting because she's not saying you wouldn't shoot a lady in her family, that kind of just totally leaves Bailey out of there. But she goes on and she says, I know you're a good man. You don't look a bit like you have common blood. I know you must come from nice people. And so this is definitely a plea to his heritage. And of course, that has to do with race, ethnicity, but also to kind of socioeconomic background. Where does he come from? Do you come from good people, i.e., with money, they go to church, that do all these things? So her first plea is not, save my family, take me, I'll shut up, they won't say anything like that. I know you wouldn't shoot a lady. You wouldn't hurt me, would you? Because she's not saying the mom's a lady. She's not talking about June Star, and we don't know if the baby, I don't know if it's a lady. So she's making this plea, and then she starts making this argument, saying, well, of course you wouldn't, because a good man wouldn't shoot a lady, and I can tell you don't have common blood in you, right? That you are better than other people. So this also shows what she sees as important. It is important for her to be better than other people. And that there are people who are not as good. And then, they're talking and talking, and listen, she said, you shouldn't call yourself the misfit because I know you're a good man. I can just look at you and tell. And so how do we judge people in terms of are they good or bad? And of course, we know he's bad. He's a murderer. She knew it from the first. But again, she's, here she's starting to fight for her life. And she says, I can just look at you and tell. So again, that she has this ability to judge who is good and who is bad by looking. And then, of course, Bobby Lee, Misfit tells Bobby Lee to take off Bailey and John Wesley, and they go off to the woods. And Grandma does call Bailey boy, the grandma called in a tragic voice. But she found she was looking at the Misfit. And she says, I know you're a good man, she said desperately, not a bit common. So again, she's trying to make a plea, but it's nothing specific. It's not, don't hurt my son, or even, look, not John Wesley. He's just a kid, right? And she says, you could be honest if only you'd try. Think how wonderful it'd be to settle down and live a comfortable life and not have to think about somebody chasing you all the time. And so here again, she's making arguments from her own perspective. She just can't see beyond this. She's like, look, you could just be honest. He's on the lam from the law, and they're murdering people. It doesn't matter how much he's honest. He's not going to be able to marry a wife and have 2.5 kids and a dog and a picket fence, right? But in her mind, this idea of, well, you could just quit this and you could settle down and change, that it's just like that being something different is that easy. That's where she is. So again, she's making this argument, but it's only from her perspective. It's only from the ways that she can see it. And then there's a pistol shot, and Bailey boy, she calls. So she does, really, she mourns for her son in that way. And then she starts saying pray. So she's moved out of, I know you're good, into the world of religion. So pray, pray, pray. And then they're talking, and she says, that's when you should have started to pray. And then, he's talking about, why he got put in jail or these things that happen. And she says, maybe they put you in by mistake. And she says, if you would pray, the old lady says, Jesus would help you. So again, she's moved from these kind of basic things of, I can see you're good and your goodness is there too. Here's one who can make you good. And so, she's bringing her religion into this. And of course, he's not buying it because he's done the thinking on religion. And he's like, look, even if it's true, it messed things up. So, I'm not saying his theory is good or anything, but that's where he's at, but he's not buying her argument. There is the key thing. And then, of course, the mother and the baby and what's her name, June Star, right, get led away. And at this point, the grandmother's alone with the misfit. And we can see, there are these moments in here where O'Connor definitely builds in the shock. The grandmother found she had lost her voice. There was not a cloud in the sky or sun. There was nothing around her but woods. This moment of if you've ever been in an accident or in very, tense moments of that noticing the strangest things or seeing things that, all of a sudden she sees this landscape around her that becomes, that thing she notices, even though, here she is, maybe she'd be trying to run or hide or whatever. These things become so clear. Finally, she found herself saying, Jesus, Jesus, meaning Jesus will help you. But the way she was saying it, it sounded like she might be cursing. Um, and then there's the piercing scream. And so this is, um, you know, the women being shot. And, back here when they're led away, again, it's really key. She didn't even say, save the baby. She didn't even say, the baby can't identify you. Go drop it off, on a road to a farmhouse, whatever. She didn't say, save the baby. None of them. So all of them have been led away. And not once does she say, let them go. It's my fault. I did this. And not even save the baby. And that's really key, because that's a big signal about where grandmother is. I mean, she's in her space. And that's all she can see is her own plight. And after they've shot, she hears all the gunshots for the mom, June Star, and the baby. She says, Bailey boy, as if her heart would break. Now, under stress, that doesn't mean she wasn't thinking of them, but this is all she can get out. I mean, it's the closest thing she can get to. And then they go into this philosophical talk about Jesus raising the dead, and the Misfit does say no pleasure but meanness. But Grandma says at this point, she's been saying Jesus will save you, this belief in religion, but then she does this thing. She sets it aside. She says maybe he didn't raise the dead. That's the crux of humanity, the dead being raised, right? Specifically Jesus. They're talking about Lazarus here, but this is the crux of it. If Jesus isn't raised, then it's just a dude who died on a cross. Maybe he had a good philosophy. So it says she didn't know what she was saying, and feeling so dizzy, she sank down in the ditch with her legs twisted under here. So this is a moment where, at this point she's gone through saying, look, I know you're good. You wouldn't shoot a lady. To saying, Jesus, pray, to basically casting off one of the major tenets of her religion and letting go of that. This is the moment where she's getting closer and closer to realizing she does not have control over this situation. And so this moment here, he says, look, I wish I'd have been there. It ain't right I wasn't there. If I was there, I would have known. Listen, lady, if I'd have been there, I'd have known, and I wouldn't be like I am now. His voice seemed about to crack, and the grandmother's head cleared for an instant. This is a clear moment. She saw the man's face twisted close to her own as if he were going to cry, and she murmured, why, you're one of my babies. You're one of my own children. She reached out to touch him on the shoulder. The misfit sprang back as if a snake had bitten him and shot her 3 times through the chest. Then he put his gun down on the ground and took off his glasses and began to clean them. She was a talker, wasn't she, says Bobby Lee, sliding down the ditch with a yodel. She would have been a good woman, the misfit said, if there'd have been somebody there to shoot her every minute of her life. And so that comes across. I remember the first time I read it, I thought, man, dude, cold as ice. But that moment is true, because when we look back, Grandma has been so in her place, never pleaded for her family, never pleaded for her children, never pleaded for anything. And in the end, there's a moment that I skipped over there where she offers to give him money. She's gone from, I know you're a good man, to pray, 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 to I give you all my money, so perhaps I can buy you that way, to even sacrificing her religion, the key tenet of her religion, on the altar of save herself, not her children, not her daughter-in-law, not the kids, not that grandbaby. And in this moment, when her head clears, she looks up and she realizes, and she hasn't been able to do this before, she has a moment where she has never seen anybody as good as her. Maybe Red Sammy's okay, right? But all through this, I mean, it's clear Grandma is all about Grandma. And this is a moment where she, through her stress, through her shock, through her trauma, through all of that, she has a moment where she looks at him and she sees beyond the end of her nose. She sees he's a person. She says, "You're one of my own. You're one of my children." And when he says she'd have been a good woman if there'd have been somebody there to shoot her every minute of her life, he's saying in that moment, not any of those other moments where she was dressed nice, not those moments where she was a lady, where she came from good stuff. He said that is the one moment. That is the one moment when she could see beyond herself that she was actually a good woman. And so what this is in literature is this is called the moment of grace. This is the moment where she opens up and she sees reality. She sees this moment. And she has this moment of grace at gunpoint. And Connie does in a way too. Where are you going? Where have you been? 1966, so some years later, not that long. But this is the 60s, so we're past the Bobby Sockers. We're into the 60s. A little bit of sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and I mean the Beatles and Elvis, and things are happening. And Connie, who is she? Well, she's 15, cranes her neck to glance in mirrors or checks other people's faces to make sure her own was all right. Everything about her had two sides, one for home, one for not anywhere. I mean, we find out Connie is a teenager. Yeah, she gripes about her mother had been pretty once, if you could believe those old snapshots in the album. But now her looks were gone. Her sister June was 24 and still lived at home. She's a secretary at the high school Connie attended. She was plain and chunky and so steady, Connie had to hear her praised all the time. Their father was away at work most of the time. When he came home, he wanted supper, and he read the newspaper at supper, and after supper he went to bed, and he didn't bother talking to them much. So, I mean, I wouldn't say it's a dysfunctional family. There is like some articles you can read where they talk about that. But, I mean, I think when I read this, I really feel Connie's perspective. And, of course, I have been a 15-year-old girl. So if you haven't, you may not see it as much. You may. I don't know. Need to tell me about that. But I mean, Connie is, yeah, she's like, she's rolling her eyes at her parents. She is a typical general kind of, my son spent all of his teen years going, "Mom," and rolling his eyes because clearly I didn't know anything. So I don't know if you have a teenager, if you've been a teenager, that isn't that atypical. And to be, it is a time of kind of figuring out, okay, I've been my parents' child, but who am I going to be as me? Because it is that crux, moving into adulthood. Am I going to follow their footsteps, my footsteps, some of both? And so Connie's in this place, and of course she's likes the boys. This is teenagehood. So anyway, but Connie gets thrust into it more abruptly and more harshly than we would want anyone to do so. So I'm going to go through, I'm going to read quite a bit of this, but bear with me because there's a point here. So, Arnold Friend, Arnold Friend, shows up, and, she's first thing is she wonders how bad she looks, right? She didn't think about really who that is, but she sees this guy who has shaggy, shabby black hair, looked crazy as a wig, and he was grinning at her. And, he just comes out of here and he's like, "I'm late. I ain't late." And she's like, "Who are you? I don't even know you." And she's, she does this thing where she tries to show she's not interested. But she's still the boy crazy teenager. This is who she is. Want to come for a ride? And she smirked and let her hair fall loose over her shoulder. "Don't you like my car and new paint job?" And he tells her, "You're cute." And she pretends to fidget. And she says, "Look, I don't even know who you are." And he goes on about Ellie. He kind of like goes off on this. And then, and we know that, he's got these mirrored sunglasses on. It says Connie blushed a little because the glasses made it impossible for her to see just what the boy was looking at. She couldn't decide if she liked him or if he was a jerk. So she dawdled in the doorway and wouldn't come down or go outside. And she asked him, "What's all that stuff painted on your car?" And, he tells her, "That's my friend. I'm Arnold Friend, and it's my real name, and I'm going to be your friend, honey." And notice he calls her honey and sweetheart and all of that. And then we've got these numbers, 13, 19, 17, and you can look up, I'll put links in the description to a number of articles on both of these stories if you want to read more. But there are some kind of interesting theories about that. For example, with um, the numbers. Oh, with the numbers, there are a number of things. Whoops, I'm sorry. I'm trying to find the right article here. There are a number of things. Let me bring this over here. Okay, there we go. Oh, let me get rid of me. Woo! A number of things with the numbers. For example, Judges 19, 17, and 33 reversed. The fact that Judges is the 33rd book from the back, book from the end of the Old Testament. So it's people can take the numbers and find this, and it does end up with that. Judges 19:7 reads, when he looked and saw the traveler in the city square, the old man asked, where are you going? Where did you come from? And that's the New International Version. And then some people do like different kind of numerical stuff. And come up with Genesis 19:17. It came to pass when they had brought them forth that he said, escape for thy life, look not behind thee, neither shall thou stay at all in all the plain, escape to the mountain lest thou be consumed. And there's kind of some interesting stuff. If you add up 33, 19, and 17, it ends up being 69, which Oates didn't really comment on this, on what it means, and I agree with a number of commentators who say it's kind of far-fetched to do all of this. I think the simplest thing is the math, because after he says this, he raised his eyebrows at her to see what she thought of, but she didn't think much. And I mean, he's a sexual predator. So, I mean, that kind of innuendo is something that he would like. So, but you can read about, there's some crazy theories. They're just as crazy as a lot of the conspiracy theories, and it's interesting, but that's not where we're going. He asked if she wants to come see more, and she says no. So we can see that she's kind of like, I don't know, I don't want to get close. And he says, don't you want to go for a ride? I don't know. Why not? And then she starts noticing things about him. He was standing in a strange way, leaning back against the car as if he were balancing himself. He wasn't tall, only an inch or so taller than she would be if she came down to him. Connie liked the way he dressed, which was the way all of them dressed. Tight faded jeans stuffed into black scuffed boots, a belt that pulled in his waist and showed how lean he was, and a white pullover shirt that was a little soiled and showed the hard muscles of his arms and shoulders. He looked as if he probably did hard work lifting and carrying things. Even his neck looked muscular, and his face was a familiar face somehow. The jaw and chin slightly darkened because he hadn't shaved for a day or two, and a nose long and hawk-like, sniffing as if she were a treat and he were going to gobble up, and it was all a joke. So she checks him out. Okay. And then he says, Connie, you ain't telling the truth. This is your day set aside for a ride with me, and you know it. He was still laughing. And she's like, how do you know my name? And he says, it's Connie. And he says, I know my Connie. He starts using these kinds of words. And then she remembers him from walking by him. And she says, where? And he says, where what? Where are we going? And he looked at her. He took off his sunglasses, and she saw how pale the skin around his eyes was, like holes that were not in shadow but instead light. His eyes were like chips of broken glass that catch the light in an amiable way. So again, we see him, and every time we get more description of him, he becomes stranger and stranger. And there are a lot of, and I think you can, I mean, clearly he is evil. And so there are a lot of articles, there's a lot of critics who compare him to the devil, an old friend. A lot of times that's kind of a comparison to Lucifer. He has this, I mean, as we go through, we'll see more details where we get these other things, the kind of stuff with his legs, or those like hooves and boots. All of these kind of things that you can make these clear comparisons to Satan. So, I mean, we can look at this metaphorically in terms of, her as being youth and being tempted, and him being the devil. Or we can also look at this as just an example of evil. And I mean, I think both of them are valid interpretations. Where I'm going right now, I'm looking at it just as evil. But anyway, let's move on. She said she never said her name, and he says, I know your name. I know lots of things about you. had not moved but was still leaning against the side of his jalopy. I took a special interest in you, such a pretty girl. I know your parents and sister are gone somewheres. I know how long they're going to be gone. I know where you were last night, and that your best girlfriend's name is Betty. And so, here she is all of a sudden, and she's like, dude, I mean, he's starting to recite all this facts to her. And, he names off other kids at school, and he says he knows them, but he gives the names, but he never answers, does he know them? He just says, I know everybody. And she says, look, you're not from around here. And why didn't I see you before? You just don't remember. And she says, I guess I'd remember you. And he says, yeah. And he looks up, and then he goes off on Ellie, and he says, didn't you see me put my sign in the air when you walked by? And remember back at the first, this guy looks at her and puts an X in the air. And so again, this kind of marking her out, this kind of evil sign. And she says, what sign? And he says, my sign. And he draws an X in the air leaning toward her. They were maybe 10 feet apart. After his hand fell back to his side, the X was still in the air, almost visible. Connie let the screen door close and stood perfectly still inside it. She stared at Arnold Friend. He stood there so stiffly, relaxed, pretending to be relaxed, with one hand idly on the door handle, as if he were keeping himself up in a way he had no intention of ever moving again. She recognized most of the things about him, the tight jeans that showed his thighs and buttocks, and the greasy leather boots and the tight shirt, and even the slippery, friendly smile of his, that sleepy, dreamy smile that all the boys used to get across ideas they didn't want to put into words. She recognized all of this, and also the sing-song way he talked, slightly mocking, kidding, but serious and a little melancholy. And she recognized the way he tapped one fist against the other in homage to the perpetual music behind him. But all of these things did not come together. And so this is really similar to Grandma. She's starting to perceive things, but she hasn't recognize them yet. And this moment here's Joyce Carol Oates writing about shock too, because instead of Grandma's, where it was just the trauma of the accident and then boom, the misfit, for Connie this is slow. This doesn't happen quickly. So one of the things Oates does well is just this kind of building of this in these moments. She notices, she says, how old are you? She couldn't see then. She could see then he wasn't a kid. He was much older, 30, maybe more. At this knowledge, her heart began to pound faster. And we have to remember she's a 15-year-old. And he tries to pass himself off as her age and then says 18. And then it says, here's more description. He grinned so broadly, his eyes became slits, and she saw how thick the lashes were. Thick and black, as if painted with a black tar-like material. So it's almost like he's got makeup on. It's kind of weird. Then he goes off on Ellie again. And then Ellie turns for the first time, and Connie saw the shock that he wasn't a kid either. He had a fair, hairless face, cheeks reddened slightly as if the veins grew too close to the surface of his skin, the face of a 40-year-old baby. Connie felt a wave of dizziness rise in her at the sight, and she stared at him as if waiting for something to change the shock of the moment and make it all right again. And so here's where it really kind of hits Connie that she's in this situation where she's 15 and these are two adult men. And so this is dawning on her, and this is the point at which shock really starts to hit her. And then, of course, it gets creepier. He says, don't you know it's Sunday all day? And honey, no matter where you were with last night, today you're with Arnold Friend, and don't you forget it. Maybe you better step out here, he said. And this last was a different voice, a little flatter, as if he was finally getting to him. And then he says, we ain't leaving until you come with us. He says, Connie, don't fool around with me. Don't fool around, he said, shaking his head. And he placed the sunglasses on top of his head carefully, as if he were indeed wearing a wig, and brought the stems down behind his ears. Connie stared at him, another wave of dizziness and fear rising over her, so that for a moment he wasn't even in focus, but just a blur, standing there against his gold car. And she had no idea he had driven up the driveway all right, but come from nowhere before that and belonged nowhere, and everything about him, and even the music that was so familiar, was only half real. And so again, here's these moments, very clear moments of shock. And then he starts doing this, say, hey, look, they're over at Aunt Tilly's, and they're sitting around and they're in the backyard, and the vision seemed to get clear, and he nodded. So you can see, he's totally playing Connie, but he clearly knows where her family is. Your sister in the blue dress, the high heels. And then he mentioned some fat woman, and that's kind of like me saying there's somebody in your life whose name starts with M. R. It's very likely you have someone in your life whose name starts with M or R, right? Some fat woman, well, women are fat, skinny, thin. It's not that hard to say that. And so whether or not he really knows or not, it's not that hard to play her, because she feeds into it, Miss Hornsby, who invited her, and then he just accepts it. And so they have this, and then boom, they stared at each other for a little while through the screen door, and he said, now what you're going to do is this. And so one of the things about this work is Oates really writes writes Arnold Friend well in terms of, his persuasion, because he gives her an order, and he does it smoothly and coolly. And if I said, look over your shoulder, if you were in the classroom and I said, stand up, you'd probably look at other people and see if they were standing up, but once one person did, you probably would. Why? Because I told you to stand up and I'm the teacher. She's realized he's an adult. And he knows this too. He's perceptive enough. And so he starts telling her, here's how this is going to go. And so, she, like Grandma, she's doing some negotiating here, because he says, here's what you're going to do. You're going to go sit up front with me, hell with Ellie. And he says, it's horrible, because he tells her, I'm your lover. You don't know what this is, but you will. I know that too. I know all about you. But look, it's real nice. And you couldn't ask for nobody better than me or more polite. I always keep my word. I'll tell you how it is. I'm always nice at first, the first time. I'll hold you so tight you won't think you have to try and get away or pretend anything, because you'll know you can. And I'll come inside you where it's all secret, and you'll give in to me, and you'll love me. And Connie's having none of this. Shut up, you're crazy. She puts her hand up against her ears, and she's as if she's heard something terrible, something not meant for her. People don't talk like that. You're crazy, she muttered. Her heart was almost too big now for her chest, and its pumping made sweat break out all over her. She looked out to see Arnold Friend pause and then take a step toward the porch, lurching. He almost fell, but like a clever drunken man, he managed to catch his balance. He wobbled in his high boots and grabbed hold of one of the porch posts. Now, one of the things that this comes from, this was actually inspired by Joyce Carol Oates. There was a story in Life about this serial killer, Charles Schmidt, who was called the Pied Piper of Tucson, and he actually, would wear makeup to look younger and everything like that, and befriended a number of high school kids in Tucson, and murdered 3 of them. And so she read this article, and this is one of the things that inspired her, because what a writer does is they think, oh, what would it be like to be in that moment, right? Whether it's good or bad. And so her writing this is about examining that from both sides. Where would this horror be? And then how would you be that person to convince like that, to do that? So anyway, Charles Schmidt clearly, like these high boots, the makeup, some of these things he really did. So we can read this and think fiction, but there's some truth in it too. So anyway, he's got something wrong with his feet, right? And then she noticed his whole face was a mask. She thought wildly, tan down to his throat, but then running out as if he had plastered makeup on his face but forgotten about his throat. So here we can see that connection to that inspired by in another place. Um, and so this just keeps spiraling, and Connie and Oates is building the shock. The kitchen looked like a place she had never seen before. The same room she had run inside, but that wasn't good enough, wasn't going to help her. Um, and then he says, look, hey, going to call the police. And he says, as soon as you touch that phone, I don't need to keep my promise and can come inside. You don't want that. And she goes to lock the screen door, and he says, look, I can break through anything, or I'd start a fire and you can come out there. She says, what do you want? He says, I want you. And she says, your daddy's not coming. Um, um, and so, she's kind of trying to do that. Yeah, my parents will be here, but he's like, no. And then he says, look, this is how it is. Come out and we'll drive away. We'll have a nice ride. But if you don't come out, we're going to wait till your people come home, and then they're all going to get it. So, he's in the place of power. Grandma thought she was, and she was trying to make the argument. Meanwhile, the misfit's having her family killed, and he's just having a conversation with her, and she never is in power. Connie realizes she's not in power. And so, Arnold Friend here is saying, look, here's the deal. You've got to do this. And so Grandma's trying, thinks she can actually get out of this okay. Whereas Connie realizes very quickly that's not happening. And so Connie has to make this choice. And there are a number of people that say, well, she goes out with him because, she walks out at the end, and it's not because of anything, but, she was either insecure or overly sexual, or, you can see through the story how she wasn't buying in this dysfunction with her parents and her family, so she was escaping that. But I don't buy that because, he constantly says, like he says, if you don't come in, if you come out, I won't hurt your family. And then they'll be fine. And then he says things like, nobody else gets hurt. I'm the boy for you. I said, come out here, nice like a lady, give me your hand. That's funny, a lady. And nobody else gets hurt. Your nice old bald-headed daddy and your mommy and sister in high heels. Because listen, why bring them into this? And so, he keeps doing that. And of course, she's just terrified. What are you going to do? 2 or 3 things. I promise they won't last long. It's all over for you here. You don't want your people in any trouble, do you? And so he keeps, bringing this up. He keeps coming back to her family. And I really see that as kind of clear support for she's got to make a choice about what is she going to do, right? Is she going to save her family? Grandma clearly, from the first, she may have felt pain for her family. It may have hurt her when those gunshots went off. We don't know. We know it was trauma. But she never made an argument for the family. And the one that always gets me as I come back to it, not even the baby. Connie's been offered the choice very clearly and very upfront. And so, that's where we look and say, what's happening? And so, she goes into the kitchen, or she turns around, bumps in, she goes into the back room, picks up the telephone, something roared in her ear. That would actually be the dial tone, but, in her shock, she's hearing this, she screams, she cries out, she cries for her mother. She felt her breath start jerking, a noisy, sorrowful, wailing noise rose all around her. So she's just in shock. And then once she settles down, he persists. He's like, look, put the phone back. And she kicks it away. He's like, no, pick it up, put it back. So again, in this moment of shock where she can't really think through things, he's one step at a time just directing her through this. And of course, that is the menace and the evil. And then we get to this moment. And he says, now you come outside. Says she was hollow with what had been fear, but what was now just emptiness. All the screaming had blasted out of her. She sat, one leg cramped under her, and deep inside her brain was something like a pinpoint of light that kept going on and would not let her relax. She thought, I'm not going to see my mother again. She thought, I'm not going to sleep in my bed again. Her bright green blouse was all wet. And we see this moment. She sat one leg cramped under her, deep inside her brain. So she's having these realizations. This is kind of the same moment that Grandma had. Maybe he didn't raise the dead, the old lady mumbled, not knowing what she was saying and feeling so dizzy she sank down in the ditch with her legs twisted under her. This moment of just kind of that realization of this is not going to turn out well. And then Arnold Friend says, the place where you came from ain't there anymore. And where you had in mind to go is canceled out. The place you are now inside your daddy's house is nothing but a cardboard box I can knock down any time. And so, part of this is this connection to the title of where are you going, where have you been? Connie has been in her present, her world. Like when she talks about her mom used to be pretty, well, if you could believe those old photos, she just can't even really see a past where her mom was young and beautiful. And so, Connie's all about, teenagers are very often very self-centered. Even though I don't think I was a spoiled brat, I know that I do think back and I'm like, wow, I should have, been more considerate. There were times I should have looked beyond myself. Maybe I couldn't. I was a teenager. So here's Connie in this moment coming to this realization, though, that, she's been just in the moment of her life and just her. And that's part of growing up is we are into ourselves and then we realize there's other people out there and they do things different way. And that's about, going to school and out in the open and growing up. And we go from just knowing our family to knowing other people. And so Connie is in this place where she's just barely moving into this kind of these early stages of trying on adulthood, and that's where she's been, and that's it. But he says the place where you came from ain't there anymore, and so this is that moment where clearly, this is her moving out of adulthood, whether she's ready or not. And then he's very explicit. He says, we'll go out in the nice field where it smells nice. I'll have my arm tied around you so you won't need to get away. And I'll show you what love is like, what it does. The hell with this house. It looks solid, all right? He says, now put your hand on your heart, honey. Feel that? That felt solid too, but we know better. Be nice to me. Be sweet like you can, because what else is there for a girl like you but to be sweet and pretty and give in and get away before her people come back. Right? And then the shock again. She thought for the first time in her life, and this is her feeling her heart, that it was nothing that was hers, that belonged to her, just a pounding. And so she has this moment, and he says again, you don't want them to get hurt. Now get up. She stood. Now turn this way. That's right. Now come through the kitchen. Let's see a smile. Try. You're a brave, sweet girl. And now they're eating corn and hot dogs cooked to bursting over an outdoor fire. And they don't know one thing about you and never did, honey. And you're better than them because not one of them would have done this for you. So, one, he's making an argument that she needs to do it for them. So, on one hand, is it really her idea or is it really her choice because she's in shock? And I think clearly, no, that takes away some of it. But at the same time, and does she really have a choice? No. But at the same time, why does she move out of there? He's always bringing it back to that. And so clearly, there's something in Connie that says this is the right thing to do because of them. And so even in these moments, he's watching her. And I love this sentence. Connie felt the linoleum under her feet. It was cool. It's just one of those moments of shock, those moments of trauma, those moments of whatever it is, when you've got some extremely bad news or found out, somebody died or if you've ever been in a car accident, when you notice the craziest, most mundane thing. This sentence captures that. She brushed her hair back out of her eyes. Arnold Friend let go of the post tentatively and opened his arms for her, his elbows pointing in toward each other and his wrists limp, to show that this was an embarrassed embrace and a little mocking. He didn't want to make her self-conscious. She put one hand on the screen. She watched herself push the door slowly open, as if she were back safe somewhere in the other doorway, watching this body and this head of long hair moving out into the sunlight where Arnold Friend waited. My sweet blue-eyed girl, he said in a half-hung sigh that had nothing to do with her brown eyes, but was taken up just the same by the vast sunlit reaches of the land beyond him and on all sides of him, so much land that Connie had never seen before and did not recognize except to know that she was going into it. So this last moment, whereas Grandma pleaded for herself, tried to, convince the misfit not to kill her with what was her logic, with religion, with money, with turning down her religion and agreeing with him. All of those things weren't any kind of realization for her. It was only in that last moment that she could look beyond herself and see him as a person. For Connie, it's not about seeing Arnold Friend as a person, as human, but it's about going beyond herself and having this moment of grace where, she walks out into this thing that she knows clearly is going to happen. This horrible thing, and we don't know what happens, and sometimes that leaves you feeling dissatisfied, but that's not the story. We know bad things happen. That's all we need to know. The story is, what does Connie do? And Connie, at 15, who's been, concerned with her hair and her looks and boy crazy and rolling her eyes at her parents and doesn't like her older sister because she's too perfect. Connie, not Grandma, not the one with the hat and the pretty dress and the gloves and the I'm a good person. Connie is the one that steps up and says, you know what, like I said, yeah, there's trauma and shock there, but she still steps out and makes that choice to go beyond herself. And beyond herself is for her family. And so the reason I do these two together is because this is a place where we see that moment of grace. We see that moment of realization of, and in two different ways. And for Grandma, it's very sad because, it's this moment where she can't have it. She can't live it in any bit. And yes, we know Connie is going to be hurt. I mean, she's clearly going to be raped. She may be killed. We don't know. But she takes that moment as her own, even through her trauma. And so Connie's moment of grace comes when she steps out and does that. And so, I mean, they're hard stories. It's easier to kind of look at A Good Man Is Hard to Find and not feel so as disturbed by it as it is Oates. I mean, Oates is very explicit in these ways, and Arnold Friend is a slippery, scary character in those ways, and especially thinking about the dynamic of their age. But in both of them, this moments of this growing shock, the way we kind of feel them change and move. And then especially for Connie, I mean, the beauty of her becoming that sacrifice, not that it's noble or good to do that. I mean, just the fact that this idea of comparison to Grandma, who's lived all her life and can't see beyond herself to do something for someone else, whereas Connie clearly can. So I kept it under an hour and a half. I know this has been long. If you stayed with me this long, thank you. I hope that, I don't know, opened your eyes. So I'll put lots of links in the description below. And it's just, literature is always something to think about. What makes us who we are? Why do we make our decisions? What do those things show about us? And that's about all I got. So I will leave you with, perhaps, if I can find my mouse, the wide open skies and thoughts to think.